Welcome to the channel of Holistic Woodworking. In this video, I'll show you how I saved an old apple tree from ending up as firewood and turned it into this tabletop. Applewood is incredibly hard and has a beautiful, warm color. But honestly, you can do this with almost any tree you want to rescue from the burn pile. Maybe it's a tree that died on your land, one your grandparents planted before you were even born. Maybe it's a leftover log from your neighbor, storm-fallen timber from the forest, or a tree removed by city services. The key thing is simple. Make sure you're not breaking any laws when you collect it. After that, epoxy resin, the natural beauty of the wood, and your desire to create something unique will do the rest. This time I used a heavy-duty reciprocating saw. Personally, I find it safer than a chainsaw, and it creates less debris. If you're working with freshly cut wood, or wood of unknown origin, proper drying is absolutely essential. Ideally, you dry the logs whole before cutting them. But if you're like me and don't have a large kiln, or you simply don't want to wait a few years, go ahead and slice the log into thick slabs. Just make sure to leave extra thickness to compensate for warping and blade marks. Wood moves as it dries, that's normal, so giving yourself that margin will save you a lot of frustration later. You can remove the bark either right after cutting the logs or after the wood has dried. It doesn't really affect cracking at that point. Personally, I find it easier to strip bark off dry wood. That said, if you leave it on during storage and drying, expect more debris and possibly a few unwanted guests hiding inside. Some insects love to sleep under bark, and trust me, you probably don't want to meet them indoors. End-grain slabs dry much faster than regular boards of the same thickness. Unfortunately, when it comes to moisture content, you can't rely on looks or touch. I've seen badly cracked pieces that still had 20–30% moisture or even more. Some of my blanks spent the winter in an unheated attic. They lost most of their moisture and developed cracks, which is normal. Still, I finished drying some of them in a convection microwave oven that allows you to control the air temperature inside the chamber. I also used it for some fresh cuts. If you're using this method, don't rush, and especially don't crank up the temperature at the end. Otherwise, the wood can start smoking. Around 100–110 degrees C is enough for fast but safe drying. You can monitor the drying progress by tracking the weight of the blocks. Once the weight stabilizes, the moisture level has likely evened out. High moisture isn't just risky because of cracking or warping, which can happen with end-grain pieces anyway, but also because water reacts with epoxy resin components and prevents proper curing. A small amount might not be critical, but once you cross a certain threshold, you risk permanently ruining your project, and that's a mistake you really don't want to make. That's why I strongly recommend using a non-contact moisture meter, even a simple, affordable one like mine. It does a good job distinguishing between dry, damp, and wet wood. I wouldn't fully trust the exact numbers, but honestly, you don't really need to. What matters is understanding the general range. Once the blanks are ready, at least flatten the bottom surface. It may look like an easy process, but that's an illusion. A router bit applies tremendous force to the wood, so never forget about safety. Always secure your workpiece properly and think about where everything will go if something fails. Sometimes I flatten pieces while they're still wet. This reduces weight by removing excess wood and debris early on. However, if the blank warps significantly during drying, you'll have to repeat the flattening process. The top surface doesn't necessarily need to be flattened. It doesn't affect how the pieces fit together very much. But to optimize epoxy consumption, it's best to make all blanks roughly the same thickness. And most importantly, make sure to always leave some extra material for the final surface flattening. It can remove a lot more wood than you might expect. The final step before assembling the puzzle is squaring the edges so they're perpendicular to the flattened face. It may look less dangerous than routing, but don't be fooled. A sanding belt can grab a piece or your fingers in an instant. If a disc has a beautiful protruding knot or burl, I try to preserve it and only trim a small edge. Fitting pieces like that takes much longer, but as always, beauty demands sacrifice. Once everything is prepared, I trim off the excess on the bandsaw. This is probably the most creative and safest part of the process. Getting a perfectly straight cut on a bandsaw is nearly impossible. Plus, internal stress is often released during cutting, slightly changing the shape of the piece, so sanding adjustments are almost always necessary. End-grain pieces already look unusual, but sometimes you want something extra. In my case, it was a disc from black chokeberry or bird cherry with two curls shaped like little ears. I found that trunk buried in a snowbank outside. You can't just place a feature piece like that anywhere. The surrounding fragments have to be carefully shaped to fit it. Assembling the puzzle is surprisingly enjoyable. Time flies. Often the wood itself suggests how pieces should fit together, but trying to preserve every knot and every growth ring pattern can actually make things harder. The more elements you add, the more difficult it becomes to maintain harmony, especially when most pieces are nearly circular. One simple method is overlapping new discs over existing ones, but then everything ends up trimmed, and the natural shapes disappear. Another issue is radial cracks. A few are fine, but when every single piece has one, the visual effect suffers. I'm not a big fan of using small filler inserts between pieces. Yes, they significantly reduce wood waste, but fitting them takes a lot of time. And there's always a risk that after finishing, they'll stand out like foreign objects because of differences in color or grain pattern. As a result, when working with small diameter end grain slices, almost half of the original log can turn into sawdust or barbecue firewood. So keep that in mind, otherwise, just like me, you might find yourself drying extra wood halfway through the project. As the structure gets closer to its final size, maintaining proper geometry becomes more and more challenging. To avoid confusion and speed up assembly, I mark control points with a few pencil lines. There's no need to remove them before pouring epoxy, since the top surface layer will be milled off later anyway. Unfortunately, small inaccuracies tend to accumulate, and wood is still a living material. It continues to move slightly during cutting and even afterward. So no matter how carefully I fit each individual joint, sooner or later a wider gap appears somewhere. Ironically, trying to make perfectly tight joints actually reduces your degrees of freedom and can make the problem worse. That's why from time to time, I end up trimming even the pieces that were already finished. Overall, I try to keep the gaps under 1 mm. If you allow larger tolerances, the work will definitely go faster, but in the end, everyone sets their own standard of perfection. At the final stage of assembling the puzzle, I mill grooves into all the internal pieces. This doesn't affect how they fit together, but it creates a structural skeleton inside the piece and improves epoxy distribution. Honestly, it's not the most pleasant process, but I now do it in every project. And just like when flattening slabs, don't forget about safety. The workpiece must be securely clamped. Always be aware that a piece can break loose and fly off at high speed in a direction known only to itself. Take your time, think ahead, and respect the tool. When the puzzle is finally assembled, creative magic gives way to chemistry. I build the mold from any sheet material wrapped in regular packing tape, plus scrap boards for the sides. Everything is tightly secured and sealed. There's no need to make a new mold for every project, just patch the holes and reuse it. The formwork I used is fairly traditional. The only difference is that the side walls are attached using pocket holes. In this project, I tried to make all the corners perfectly square already at the pouring stage. As you might guess, that created nothing but problems, and later I completely abandoned this absurd practice. It's far more practical to make the piece a couple of centimeters oversized and trim the finished slab afterward. Like I mentioned earlier, super tight joints and perfectly square formwork actually create extra problems. When there's zero room to compensate for tiny inaccuracies, the mosaic pieces start creeping apart in every direction, doing their own thing. Those slightly comical moves you see on screen are my attempts to minimize that mess. I believe the more epoxy resin penetrates the wood and fills the cracks, the stronger the final piece will be. So I don't pre-seal the wood and I don't glue it to the base. I use a low viscosity epoxy with a long curing time. For pigment, I add a small amount of natural graphite. When pouring, don't rush. Let the resin flow into internal cavities. I never accurately predict how much I'll need, so I mix in small batches. Smaller volumes are easier to mix thoroughly, and while I prepare the next batch, the previous one has time to settle. Wood is lighter than epoxy, so it will float. Every piece must be pressed down, which doesn't look very glamorous during the pour. In this project, that part didn't make it on camera, but you can see the evidence on the cured surface. Like I mentioned earlier, for projects like this, you can really use just about any wood species you like. Surprisingly, the density of the wood doesn't have a huge impact on how hard the final piece will feel once it's finished. In fact, medium-density woods can sometimes turn out even more stable after they've been fully infused with epoxy resin. And even a few slightly punky or partially decayed areas are totally acceptable, as long as the wood is properly dried and you're okay with using a bit more epoxy. On my channel, you'll already find projects made from linden, chestnut, and acacia, and coming up soon, elm, hornbeam, and even some bog oak. A heat gun works great for popping bubbles. It looks impressive, though practically speaking, most surface bubbles will be removed later during flattening anyway. Separating the cured slab from the base isn't difficult, but wear gloves. Hardened epoxy edges are razor sharp. Next, I remove excess resin with a router. On larger projects, I switch to new carbide inserts for the final passes. It makes sanding much easier afterward. Then I trim the slab to its final dimensions. The side margins are no longer needed. Into the underside of the tabletop, I embed a steel frame. It won't completely prevent warping if the wood decides to move, but it reduces the amplitude, acting like a spring. For this project, I used a welding machine for the first time in my life. I chose not to film that intimate moment, but in future videos, you'll definitely see some sparks flying. Interestingly, you can actually see how epoxy seeps through wood that has already been saturated with it. I honestly didn't expect that. In this video, I'll spare you the sanding montage, the part every woodworker secretly loves, but trust me, it happened. Finishing remains the hardest part for me. I'd really appreciate your advice in the comments. First, I tried a high-quality polyurethane varnish. It works beautifully on new wood and restorations. Here, though, the result was terrible, so bad that even my camera refused to film it. After that, I didn't feel like recording my failed attempts. Eventually, I removed the varnish and tried oil from Minwax. The first coat looked promising. Each additional coat looked worse. The most acceptable result came with oil from Osmo, but there's still plenty of room for improvement, so I'm open to your suggestions. Despite a few missteps, I'm very happy with the final result. And more importantly, I gained valuable experience for future builds. If you're thinking about working with end-grain wood and epoxy resin, I strongly recommend starting with small projects using free or reclaimed wood. There are many hidden pitfalls here, and it would be frustrating to spend a lot of money on resin without getting the results you hoped for. That's almost everything I wanted to share in this episode of my series, From Log to Art. The next projects will be significantly more complex. Feel free to like and subscribe, there's a lot more interesting stuff coming. Thanks for watching.